ever hold the cross before our eyes, so that we can always be reminded of what you have done through your Son Jesus. As he lived perfectly, died on the cross for our sins, rose again so that we may have the promise of everlasting life. Lord God, thank you. Help us, Lord God, in our lives to see that there are no coincidences, that you are ever present in our lives, wishing us to see you at work in our lives, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Lord God, help us to see you and give witness to you at all times and in all places. In your name we pray. Amen. In 1682, a most unusual thing happened. The entire village of Brunswick, England, slipped into the sea. Yes, such tragedies will happen from time to time. But the amazing thing is, my friends, is that nobody in the entire village died. Nobody drowned. None. You know why? Everyone in the town of Brunswick was in another town for a funeral. Huh. True story. That's a true story. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It really is a true story. Coincidence or divine providence? What I mean is, was it a coincidence that nobody perished as Brunswick slipped into sea? That everyone in the village, men, women, and children, all happened to be gone at this very moment. Coincidence? Let's try another one. Dr. Steve Land tells about a seminary student during World War II who was preparing himself to enter service as a military chaplain. One day, this student found a used book on how to speak Russian. The student was somewhat of an introvert, so he decided that this little book on how to speak Russian would be a nice, quiet way to spend his evenings. From then until his graduation, he studied that Russian language book whenever he had a chance. After graduation, the young man was inducted into the Army as a chaplain. He was sent to Europe, where his battalion was involved in heavy fighting. One night, as he lay on his bedroll, staring up at the stars, he became depressed every day and every night as he constantly was giving comfort to wounded and dying soldiers. Seminary didn't prepare him for this fact, and he did not feel prepared for anything that he was being asked to do. He was feeling sorry for himself. And then, just at that very moment, as those thoughts were rolling through his head, a medic came running up to him. "Chaplain," he said, "we have a man who is seriously injured, but he's scared and panicking, but we can't understand a word he's saying. Can you help us?" So he came here. Amazingly, he knew the man was speaking Russian. And the little that he learned, and he was able to speak words of comfort to this dying man until his dying breath. As he returned to his bedroll, he lay down under the stars once again. The young chaplain felt that somehow the stars were brighter and the load that he was carrying was a little lighter. He now knew that God was at work even in this awful war. Coincidence? Or divine providence? Did God lead this young soldier to study Russian just for this particular moment in his life? I guess it all depends. It all depends on what you believe about the universe. And really, it all depends on what you believe about God. The Apostle Paul had many unusual experiences that brought him into contact with a wide range of people. He was shipwrecked, jailed. He traveled all over the countries on the rim of the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes he didn't know exactly where he would be going, or why, or who he would meet when he got there. Nevertheless, when the Lord prompted him to go, he went, because he trusted that God would show him what to do. God led, and he followed. One night, Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia. This man was standing and begging to Paul, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Paul believed this was a call from God. He and 3 of his friends embarked at once for Macedonia. However, the trip to Macedonia wasn't easy. They traveled by boat and were forced to make stops along the way. One of those stops was in a little place called Philippi, the leading city of the district of Macedonia. Paul and his friends stayed there several days. Now, there was no synagogue in Philippi. This was a Gentile city. So when the Sabbath came, they went down to the river to find a place to pray. Now, it was common at this time in history for faithful people, faithful, pious people, especially of Jewish faith, to go down to the river to pray. There was a group of women by the river who also came to pray. So Paul and his companions began talking with them. One of the women was named Lydia. Visualize Lydia as a successful businesswoman. Slender, smartly dressed, carrying her briefcase in one hand, her smartphone in the other. Lydia would be quite comfortable in our world today. Quite comfortable indeed. Lydia was a dealer in purple cloth and probably quite wealthy. Purple, you see, was the color of the Roman elite. Indeed, the emperor, and only the emperor, would wear a toga made entirely of purple cloth. Purple dye was expensive. It was made from a juice found in small quantities in shellfish. It took thousands of these small crustaceans to make a yard or 2 of purple cloth. Purple dye was rare, and purple fabric was worth its weight in silver. Franchises for dealing in purple were highly coveted. That Lydia was a woman of considerable means is also evidenced by the size of her house. At the conclusion of this short vignette, she invites Paul and those who are with him to come and stay at her house. What makes this impressive is that Lydia did not live alone. There were others in Lydia's household, probably servants as well as children. Lydia seems to have been the head of her household. No husband is mentioned. Perhaps she was a widow. We simply don't know. There could have been extended family any way you look at it. To house 4 traveling evangelists in addition to the rest of her household means that it was a pretty impressive place. It's important to note that Lydia was not Jewish, but she did worship God. As Lydia listened to Paul's message, Luke tells us that the Lord opened her heart to the message of Jesus. And right there on the spot, she and all the members of her household are baptized into the Christian faith. Afterwards, she invited Paul and his friends to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And they accepted her kind hospitality. It really is a beautiful story, isn't it? Now, if you had asked Lydia, "Did you just happen to be there when the Apostle Paul came down to the river?" how do you think she would respond? How do you think Lydia would respond? Was it providence? Or was it coincidence? God's hand or mere happenstance? Obviously, you could make a case either way, but I believe that Lydia would have said, it was providence. It was God. God brought me to that spot just so I could hear the gospel. I believe that Lydia would say her encounter with Paul was God's hand at work because Lydia was a person of faith even before she was exposed to the gospel. This is important. This is a tendency. This is important because there is a tendency on the part of some religious people to divide the world into the saved and the unsaved, the righteous and the unrighteous. If you're not a baptized believer in these people's eyes, then you are somehow inferior, unacceptable, probably immoral too. Interestingly enough, the New Testament isn't that narrow. In the New Testament, there are Jews and there are Christians. And then there are those who are referred to as God-fearers. Lydia fits into the description as a God-fearer. Luke refers to Lydia simply as a worshiper of God. In today's church language, we might call her a seeker, someone who is outside of the traditional faith, but is still seeking God. Last week, we read about another God-fearer. His name was Cornelius. Cornelius was an officer in what was known as the Italian regiment of the Roman army. Cornelius commanded 100 men whose main job was to maintain order in Caesarea. Cornelius was neither Jewish nor Christian. Luke describes him and his family as devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. Are you getting this? When asked whether there can be someone who is outside the mainstream Judeo-Christian faith and still be devout and God-fearing, the answer is, of course. In fact, according to the book of Acts, you can be outside the mainstream of the faith community and still be used by God. Cornelius is a great example of this. One afternoon, about 3 o'clock, Cornelius has a vision. He sees an angel of God. The angel comes to him and says, "Cornelius!" Whoa. Whoa. It's not every day that you see an angel of God. Cornelius isn't prepared. He stares at the angel and is afraid. "What is it, Lord?" he asks timidly. The angel says to him, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have caught God's attention. He has a job for you. You are to send some of your men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and another devout soldier. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. All of this was happening while Peter was having his famous vision on the top of the roof. That's the vision where he sees this sheet lowered down from heaven, and it's got every kind of animal on it. Clean animals, unclean animals. And God tells him, "Peter, kill, eat." And he says, "No, Lord. I've never let anything unclean touch my lips." And God says, "Don't call what I've made clean unclean." Happens 3 times. It was the vision that allowed Peter to understand that it was all right for him to break bread with Gentiles. It was to Cornelius' house that God summoned Simon Peter. A life-changing experience for Peter. A life-changing experience for Cornelius. A life-changing experience for the Christian church. And it came through this non-Jewish, not yet Christian man named Cornelius. In New Testament terms, Cornelius and Lydia were God-fearers. So it was no accident, no coincidence, that Lydia was down at the river worshiping God when she encountered the Apostle Paul. Lydia was hungry for God. Now here's why I've belabored this point. Our land is filled with people like Lydia and Cornelius. Our world is filled with Lydias and Corneliuses. There are fine, decent people in our society who are seeking God. They have little or no church background. They may have been turned off by the church at some time in the past. They may have been hurt by the church. And yet they hunger for God. Maybe they hunger for God because they've seen the bankruptcy of other approaches to life. They're disgusted by the hedonism and the materialism of our greater society. They want solid, life-changing values. They want something they can depend on as they wind through this life. And we, the church, need to reach out to them. We need to encounter them where they are and share genuinely and generously what God has done in our life. If we do that, God will use our witness in marvelous ways. There's a story that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross tells. She tells about a woman that she encountered as she was writing her famous book on death and dying. Part of Dr. Kubler-Ross's research involved interviewing dying patients in the hospital, trying to find out how they felt and what they thought as they faced death. As she went from room to room in the hospital, she began to notice a remarkable pattern. Sometimes she would go into a dying person's room and the person would be calm, at peace, even tranquil. She also began to notice that often this was after the patient's room had been cleaned by a certain hospital orderly. One day, Dr. Kubler-Ross happened to run into this orderly in the hospital. The doctor asked her, "What are you doing with my patients?" The orderly thought she was being reprimanded by Dr. Kubler-Ross and answered, "I'm not doing anything with your patients." No, she said, "You're doing something. It's a good thing. After you go into their rooms, they seem to be at peace. What are you doing?" "I just talked to them," she said. "You know, I've had 2 babies and of my own die on my lap, but God never abandoned me. I tell them that. I tell them that they're not alone, that God is with them, and that they don't have to be afraid." Now let's imagine for a moment that you're that patient. And you've reached a low point in your life. A gentle and caring hospital worker comes into your room, and as she cleans your room, she listens. She listens to your concerns and quietly shares with you that she is once in your situation. She reached out to God, and God was there, and God helped her through. And you're helped by this genuine act of caring and sharing. In fact, you come out of that hospital experience a stronger person than when you went in. It changes you. It changes how you deal with life. Later, you look back on the experience. How do you explain it? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it God you encountered through this woman in your time of need? In truth, it's both. It may indeed be happenstance that you were assigned to that particular room or that woman just happened to be working. But it also is God, because she yielded herself to Him. And it was God working through her, reaching out to all who would heed her calming and reassuring message. You see, this is how Paul looked at his life. He had many adventures, not all of them pleasant, but he knew that wherever he was, God would use him. And so when there was no synagogue in Philippi where he could worship, he and his friends looked for a place down by the river, because that's where others would join in prayer. And when they encountered these women and realized that they were women who were seeking after God, they knew that God had brought them to this place. And so there they shared from their heart. And this smart, successful woman named Lydia responded to their message. She and all of her household were baptized and became followers of Jesus Christ. And if you had later heard Lydia tell her story, my guess is that she would say, "I was so fortunate. I was so fortunate that God led me to that place so that I could hear the message of His Son Jesus. Changed my life forever." Brothers and sisters, the Lydias of this world are all around us. They're all around us. They're waiting for you and me to reach out to them with the love of Jesus Christ. We can be a tool of God's providence and grace if we yield ourselves to be used by God. we will look in every conversation that we have. It's not a coincidence, but as a divine encounter, a moment we can share the love of God. Many of these so-called coincidences we will see are in fact God's providence in disguise. May it be so. In Jesus' name. Amen. Now collect.